Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Semifinals overview and analysis video here in the spring playoffs. We are here. We know G2 is in the finals. We know G2 is heading to MSI at the very least as the number 2 team out of the LEC. But today, in these semifinals, we are going to figure out not only the team that will be joining G2 in the finals and, having a chance to fight for that LEC trophy in this spring split, but the team that is going to be joining G2 at MSI at the mid-season invitational, as well as we've got two teams that are second and third in terms of championship points, no matter whether or not they are able to win the LEC finals. So a lot on the line for both of these teams here today. Would love to know what you thought of this series, what you expected to see from these two teams going into this series down in the comment section below. Did it live up to your expectations? Were you surprised at all by the outcome? I think both of these teams have a very strong case to be made to be favorites going into this series. I certainly don't think it's clear-cut for any means, and I'm excited to see where it goes, but I would love to know what you guys' thoughts were before the series down in the comments section below. But of course, if you want to know my thoughts, if you want to know my preview of what I expected, I covered it very loosely at the end, of course, of the previous video that we covered basically the entirety of last weekend, just a couple of days ago. That's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. The Spring Split playlist for the LEC is also going to be listed up in the iCard. You can check out every single weekly review that we've done for all 3 weeks in the regular season, as well as the 2 weekends of the playoffs. Up until this point, we've covered every single game of the LEC so far in 2024, and that is definitely not going to stop here. So I am very excited. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we go game by game in the series that we talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we talk about, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will very quickly be previewing the finals at the end of this video, but today is actually arguably more important. I know it's crazy to say that the semifinals are more important, but qualifying for an international tournament, I think, is what a lot of LEC teams really kind of desire to do. So a lot on the line for both of the teams here today, but that's enough preamble. That's enough of the beginning out of the way. It's time to get into the actual analysis. Of course, it is a matchup between the number 5 seeded Team BDS and the number 1 seeded Fnatic, which sounds very strange here to get into the semifinals this way, but both of these teams have gone through their ups and downs, I would say, throughout this playoff run so far. I think BDS has really benefited from the absolutely horrid playoff structure that the LEC has, the way that they seed the two sides of the bracket. I think BDS had by far the best draw in that regard. As the 5 seed, they were pretty likely going to be the best team on their side of the bracket. They had teams like Heretics and Vitality on that side, but that was never really going to be a problem. Now, Heretics was their draw that they were supposed to get, and theoretically, I guess you could say that, a team like Vitality could have been on their side, but this should have been a matchup earlier in the playoffs in terms of how this bracket ended up working out. BDS was very lucky, I think, to dodge a lot of good teams in terms of the early part of the bracket. Like I said, they probably got the best draw of any team in the entire tournament, and they pushed it all the way to winners finals. They were the best team on their side. They got to winners finals. They got to that best of 5 against G2, and they just couldn't quite get over the hump. They actually showed a lot of really good things, but quite frankly, they lost it for themselves. They had a lot of really dumb errors, a lot of really big mistakes that ended up costing them a couple of games, and you can't really get away with that against G2. I know that that team's not exactly the most well-rounded in the entire universe right now. We've talked extensively about how some of their players have just not stepped up to the plate as consistently, but their best players are the best in the entire region, and that means you do have to not make mistakes, because those are the kinds of players that are going to take advantage of that. BDS couldn't avoid them, and that's the reason they are here in the lower bracket. They have been excellent throughout the playoffs, but they did struggle a bit in the regular season. Honestly, it's kind of difficult to get a read on this team and to kind of get an understanding of how good they are. I think when you go lane by lane in terms of this matchup, you can make an argument that they are ahead or behind in any role, in all 5 roles. It is a really interesting conversation to have. There are a couple of roles that I feel pretty confident they are going to be stronger in. Support definitely jumps out as one where it's like, yeah, they should have a better support. They absolutely should have a better top laner, but everything else, like, do I really feel confident in BDS? No, I don't, but can I feel confident in BDS? Yeah, it would be totally possible for them to come out here in 3-0 and dominate and look great like they did for a lot of the playoffs. They just haven't really been tested in that same kind of way, and the one time they were against G2, they really didn't make the most of it, so it'll be interesting to see what they are here, but Fnatic is kind of the opposite. They have had a ridiculously tough draw considering they they were the #1 seed. Some way, somehow they ended up on the same side of the bracket as G2. Again, horrible structure in terms of how this ends up operating. That really should have never happened. And it sucks. It makes the 1 seed essentially useless for Fnatic, and they really struggled because of it. They had to be on the same side of the bracket as the best team, who just kind of took a couple of games off in the regular season. It meant they went down to the lower bracket a lot quicker than I think they anticipated, but luckily they were still able to get over the hump. They were able to get through a team like Heretics. They were able to get through Vitality, both of which were not particularly easy series, but they won them, and that's all that really matters in the end. Fnatic, contrary to BDS, had a really good regular season, beat teams like G2 in the regular season, really showed that they could hang with some of the best in the entire league, but they also have real concerns on paper. First of all, they've really not looked all that excellent in the playoffs. The bot lane has certainly been improved, but the big driving force for this team through a lot of the beginning of the year was Razork and Humanoid just being the two best players, in their positions for a lot of different games that they were playing. They just haven't been that recently, and I think that's going to be a make or break thing for this team in this series. Oscar Rinnan is also, in my opinion, a major question mark in terms of what you are going to be getting out of him in these major series. We know he can play weak side. We know he's been okay on tanks, things like Cassante and Rek'Sai and Zac. These are things that have been able to bail him out in easier situations, but what happens when he's not available to play those champions? What happens when they are not left up in draft, when he has to play something more aggressive? Can he survive against someone like Adam, who's almost certainly going to be able to punish any sort of major errors that he makes? It's going to be a question mark. Same thing for Noah and June. They've been better in the playoffs, but they were awful in the winter split, and they were pretty bad in the spring split in the regular season. They've been okay over the last week or so, but Ice and LeBrav are certainly not a pushover of a bot lane. In my opinion, they are the most consistent bot lane in the LEC, and so there are real question marks for Fnatic, but all that being said, they were better than this team in the regular season, and it wasn't particularly close. Like, I felt so much more confident about Fnatic going into the playoffs, and so it's really going to be up to which team shows up on the day. I really don't think this is going to be a predictable series. The LEC is hardly ever predictable, but both of these teams are going to be going into this thinking they are the favorites, thinking they should be walking out. Only one can be correct, though, and that, of course, starts with game #1. So let's talk about it. The winner of game #1 was BDS. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And again, establishing pressure early on in a series like this, it's critical. It is super important towards actually being able to win the series in the long haul, because not only is it important for you to be able to know that you can beat the team that you're playing against on the day, but to establish that momentum to show like, hey, we're feeling it. We're in a good zone today. The mental impact of winning the first game cannot be understated. Fnatic's not out by any means, but this was a really dominant game from BDS. They basically won across the board, which is exactly what you would have wanted to see from them. For Fnatic, they really struggled with a comp that I think should be relatively standard, and that is a bit concerning. I'm not going to sit here and panic, because I do think there are pieces on this team that don't necessarily fit into the identity and the ideology that this team has gone through throughout the entirety of this year, really, in the good parts and in the bad parts. But, I mean, this is about as standard as it gets on the current patch, and you just really didn't feel comfortable at all piloting a lot of these champions, and I'll talk about that when we get here. But for BDS, player of the game was honestly so difficult. Basically, everybody played well. I really fluctuated between 4 players in particular. They were Ice in the bot lane, who I thought was excellent on the Xayah, Nuke in the mid lane, who I thought was very good on the Taliyah, but I'm going to give it to Adam in the top lane on the Yasuo. I want to say very quickly, I think this is like the perfect prototypical draft, and to me, this collection of 5, really like 4.5 champions is why I consider Blue Side to be so strong right now, why we're seeing that win rate skyrocket in the playoffs. It's because of drafts like this. If you can be one Taliyah, first of all, that's already enough. Like, Taliyah is so broken, in my opinion, right now. This is the guy, I want to reiterate, this is the guy who has defended Smolder, who has defended Zeri, who has defended all these hyper carries that are consistently called unplayable against and, like, completely broken and cancerous and toxic for the game. I've been the guy who's pushed back and said, yeah, they're very strong. They're the strongest champs in the game, but they're not unbeatable. They have weaknesses. You know, we've seen these champions lose. They have below 50% win rates in pro, and like, there's reasons why teams would opt into other matchups rather than constantly picking Zeri and Smolder every single game, even when they're strong. That's where I'm coming from, and I'm gonna say Taliyah is one of the most unbelievable picks, and we'll continue to see that. She just does everything, man. Like, I don't think she's crazy broken, but she's so useful. Like, there is almost no situation in which you'd rather have a different mid laner unless you're actively just trying to go for a completely different style, because Taliyah fits every comp. She does every bit of, the thing you would want out of the mid laner. She has incredible push and incredible pressure. She has great macro back row presence. She can move around and she can skirmish early. She's a really solid team fighter because she pairs up well with a lot of the other very good AD carries or supports or junglers that are meta right now. She can split push. She can team fight. She can carry in terms of damage if she's far enough ahead. There are very few circumstances in which Taliyah is not at worst one of the top 2 to 3 mid laners to have at any time in any situation in a game. And so to get that on B1, I think is already a win. Xayah Rakan to me is another one of those just plug and play bot lanes. I know they're not as strong as they've been in years past, but they're still super reliable, and obviously Ice and Labrov can play them at a high level. I love tank jungles, especially if you're going to pair it up with something like a Taliyah, and if you want to go for counter pick in the top side, I think something like Sedge or Maokai really fit that ideology, and then you can pick whatever you want on the top side of the map. R5 Yasuo this game because it counters Twisted Fate? Sure, if you can pilot it well, if you can win lane, that's the point. This, to me, is the exact prototype for what I would do in draft, and I think it was kind of shown in this game why exactly I feel so strongly about some of these champions. Adam gets player of the game because he dominated Oscar Rinnan. Like, this was not a particularly close top lane matchup. The counter pick absolutely worked, and it's really nice to see Adam actually get to play something really aggressive on the top side of the map and make it work. He's kind of been limited, or certainly not nearly as dominant as he has been in previous splits for me in spring so far, and so it's nice to see kind of the old version of Adam come back here, or the version that we saw last split and last year that I think really stepped BDS's game up. Sheo, Nuke, Ice, Labrov, they were all excellent. Nuke and Ice in particular as carries were fantastic. How much of that were the champions? I think a lot of it, like Taliyah, was just ridiculous in this map. Once you get the ball rolling on that champion, it's essentially impossible to stop. She does literally everything. And then Xayah's just so safe. It is really easy to pilot her in the early game against something like Zeri, and it's not like she scales entirely poorly. She doesn't scale maybe as well as some of the other hyper carries or as well as she did, last year when she was still pre-nerf, but she still scales incredibly well. Like, she's still going to be really strong in these isolated 5v5s. Labrov made some incredible engages on Rakan. Sheo's very good at Sejuani, and he's been playing better as of late. This was just a stereotypical, this is how you win the game from BDS. But for Fnatic, again, I don't hate the comp in theory because I think this is a comp that you have to be able to execute on if you're going to be one of the best teams on this patch. This is a very standard comp of Twisted Fate, Azir, Zeri. The combo of those 3 carries has to be able to work for you, but these players just didn't feel comfortable at all, specifically Oscar Rinnan on the top side on this Twisted Fate. I know his scoreline doesn't look as bad as the others, but his gameplay was worse. That I can absolutely promise. He was in bad positions, just way too far forward. It felt like he was not comfortable or natural on the TF. There's a reason this guy is stuck to tanks a lot of this year, and that's because he's constantly pushed forward. He knows he has a bit more of an aggressive early lane playstyle. And on things like Zac, or on things like Rek'Sai, or on things like Asante, you can get away with that a bit more because not only do you have at least decent mobility on all of those champions, but also you're tanky enough to be able to survive initial bursts. TF doesn't have that same kind of flexibility, and so when you get caught out in these circumstances as TF, you're just gonna die, and it makes you look very useless, and that's what Oscar ran into a lot of this game. He could potentially be a massive liability for this team moving forward. It's not like their stars were better either, though. Razork, Humanoid, they didn't play particularly well. Poppy on R5 really was inconsequential in this game. I like the idea of it, but Taliyah kind of just does Poppy's job, but like better, and so you end up just not really being all that relevant throughout the game, and Razork lost pressure early, and it was never recoverable. Humanoid was never relevant. Again, when you lose prio in the mid lane, it becomes significantly harder to play the game. The reason Azir has worked in a lot of other situations in other regions is because you have these early game junglers, or alternatively like Kalista down in the bot lane, or even a Xayah that can push a lot of tempo and really fight over objectives, so you're not really forcing Azir to join a lot of these plays. You don't have that same flexibility when you draft Azir, Zeri, and even a Poppy that really aren't going to be able to contest a lot of these objectives, and so when you get to the part of the game where they're supposed to be strong, you just don't really have a lot of options. Same thing for Noah and June. I don't even think they played all that bad. They really didn't do anything all that negative, but they couldn't stand up to Xayah and Rakan in the early game, and they couldn't stand up to them in the late game either because they were so far ahead, and so you end up in this situation where it's just a lose-lose. I don't feel like this comp is the problem. I feel like the comp is a problem for Fnatic, if that makes sense. You gotta draft safer on the top side, or else, Oscar's just gonna continue to get taken advantage of. Adam is significantly more talented than Oscar is as an individual player, and I think it's very clear to see, and quite frankly, Razork and Humanoid just simply have to be better, whether it's on, aggressive early game champions or not. They have to be relevant in these games. They are stars for a reason. They are considered stars. You can't just say that they're stars and have them, underperform in a series against Sheo and Nuke. It has to be there in this do or die series, but it has to be there in game 2. You don't want to go down 2-0 to a team like BDS. Winning 3 games in a row is super hard. It doesn't even really matter who it's against. Winning 3 games in a row at a professional level is not easy. This is a very important game 2 for Fnatic. Are they going to be able to take it, or is BDS going to take a commanding series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was BDS, they are going to take game number 2. They are going to go up in this series 2-0, and that is a pretty commanding lead to have. Now, Fnatic has never counted out of any of these series, not only this group of 5, which has gone to 5 games as often as they possibly can, but also this organization has a history of having some weird comebacks, some crazy reverse sweeps, and so I'm certainly not putting anything out of my mind, but BDS looks excellent through the first 2 games. Very similar draft, a little bit of a different identity. They wanted to go for the Xin Zhao in the jungle instead of the Sejuani. I do think that pretty drastically changes how you want to play the early game, but I think you can make an argument that with Taliyah in particular, it actually does benefit a lot of the ideas that you want to do through the jungle mid early on, and so I don't really hate that idea. It gives you a little bit less stability in terms of late game insurance, but you are going to be a bit more proactive, and as long as you are willing to step up to the plate and be proactive and, take a lot of fights, take a lot of skirmishes in the early to mid game, then it should be fine. As long as you're able to, snowball the game out of control, it's going to be even stronger in that regard with something like Xin Zhao. But for Fnatic, they heard my advice. They said, oh, okay, so the problem was that Oscar was on something too proactive. Okay, well, we'll put him on Cassante and we will change nothing else. And here we are with an even less proactive team, a team that really has no agency in the game at all. And there were a couple picks on this team that obviously I like. Honestly, I like every single pick on this team in isolation. But I think as a group, especially on Fnatic, a team that just doesn't want to sit around and scale, I don't get it. I don't get the idea here. BDS had all the pressure in this game, and they ended it rather clinically and rather quickly. This was not a difficult game for them to win, so we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Nuke. This might be a bit surprising because Ice continues to look excellent on this Xayah. I think it should go to one of them. Both of them were excellent, but I wanted to give a lot of credit to Nuke. Obviously, him and Adam have been in the news this week. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but it is fun to see Nuke come out, pick something like Taliyah, be super proactive on the map, and really kind of make a difference. I've talked a lot about how Taliyah, in my opinion, is very strong. I think it's the most consistent pick in the entire game. To me, it is a clear ban, or if it's left up on blue side, it is the clearest B1 in the entire game. I don't really think there's any reason to not pick Taliyah, because you can build anything around it. It doesn't limit you in any way, shape, or form, and it's really not counterable in that kind of way. There aren't a lot of champions out there that are going to be able to match what Taliyah can do, especially from the mid lane, but, Nuke still has to go out there and play it. You still have to be aggressive. You still have to be, a playmaker. You still have to look at the game from a more objectively proactive way, I guess. You have to be looking at ways to move the game forward rather than, on Azir or on Orianna or some of these other champions that are getting high priority in the mid lane, kind of just letting the game happen and capitalizing on the situations that allow you to capitalize. Like, Taliyah is a much more active champion than those champions are, and so you do have to go out there and do things on the champ. But again, especially if you're going to draft something like Xin Zhao with it as the jungler, you have so many opportunities to just go out and make plays and to do things, because there's really not a lot of skirmishes that Xin Zhao plus Taliyah can't win in the early game, especially against Maokai Azir. Like, they're not going to be able to do anything in that jungle mid. So credit to BDS. I think they executed on it well, but Xayah is clearly a massive pick here for BDS. I'm going to be interested to see if this becomes a ban target. I think it's more likely than something like Taliyah, because I think as soon as Fnatic figures out, oh, we should be playing blue side. We lost game number 1 and we picked red side. As soon as they figure out that that's a mistake, I think they're going to get blue side, and I think they're going to have the opportunity to get Taliyah early on in draft if BDS don't want to ban it. But I think Xayah could potentially be on that ban list moving forward, specifically the Xayah, because it has been so consistent for Ice so far in this series. He has looked excellent, really has not been out of place at all, and really feels very comfortable on that champion. Him and Labrov have very good chemistry in terms of the lovers duo, and I would expect that to at least take some sort of dip moving forward. But Sheo was very good in this game number 2. I would argue that this was even better than his game number 1. Adam, still pretty solid, didn't really have to do anything on the Gragas. B5, he got counterpicked, and so he wasn't super aggro in lane like he was in game 1 on the Yasuo, but you would expect that in a situation where he's not nearly as proactive, but he was still fine, and it certainly allowed the rest of the team to be more proactive in terms of the way they play the early game, and generally just snowballing it out of control. Yeah, that's something BDS can do, and so this is a good win, and it puts them in a dominant spot. But for Fnatic, this is not good. You are 1 game away from being eliminated, and you haven't won a single game against BDS so far in this series, and I continue to think that it's just a bad meta read. It's a bad read on your own individual skills and, what you are individually good at. Maokai, Azir, Zeri, I mean, come on. I love Maokai. I am, the biggest Maokai proponent in the world. We've talked, we do the LPL reviews every single time there's a series on this channel, and I've said throughout the entire process that if there's one mid-jungle duo that can keep up with anything Taliyah related, it's Maokai Tristana. I think it is very clear that those two champions have been incredibly successful. They have actively carried multiple teams across the LPL the entirety of this playoff run, but Maokai individually is just not that kind of champion. champ. I think he's a little bit better in isolation than something like Tristana is, but Maokai Azir, sorry, that's not going to keep up with Taliyah. That's not going to be able to skirmish with her early. That's not going to give you the stability and objective control that you pick Maokai for. All of a sudden, the Azir is now getting behind, and Humanoid did an okay job of trying to pull himself back into this game, significantly better than he was in game 1, by the way. But it just didn't matter. Like, Noah couldn't actually play the game because, once again, he's in a losing matchup in the bot lane, and the rest of his team isn't exactly getting enough pressure to allow him to scale. Razork can't play the game. He's going to get dead of the game on the Maokai, because truly, what is the tree supposed to do here? Lose? Like, I really don't know where he's supposed to gain his advantages. He can't contest Xin Zhao at any point. He's not going to have any priority in the mid lane. His bot lane is losing. Where is he supposed to do things on the map in this game? And, you know, shout out to Oscar. He was generally fine. He got his R5 Cassante, you know, his one good champion, but he's not going to break the game. This was just, I don't get it. I don't get the thought process behind it. Now you're in a gigantic hole. You're in a bad spot if you're Fnatic here. Down 0-2, you have to win all 3 of the rest of these games in a row. A pretty monumental task. It's going to have to start, of course, with game 3, but, you know, obviously BDS has all the momentum. They could very well come out in game number 3 and just end this series off in a clean sweep. Is that what's going to happen? Or is Fnatic going to be able to keep it alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to stay alive in this series at the very minimum for one more game, and they did it in much, much cleaner fashion. Turns out blue side's a lot easier to draft for than red side is. You don't constantly have to go for a lot of these late game picks. I really don't hate what BDS did. I think they have a very good understanding of where the meta is at right now. I have small critiques, but they're really only in hindsight, and it's really only because it didn't end up working. I really don't dislike the way that they went with their draft, but Fnatic, I think, has something that they can work with significantly more here in game 3 than especially the game 2 draft, but also the game 1 draft, where I just didn't think they had a lot of tools that kind of fit into their tool belt, if you will. Player of the game for me in game number 3 is going to go to June. This one was not particularly difficult to pick for me. June was excellent in this game, and really saying that has become more of a regular occurrence over the past couple of weeks. I was, I should say, the biggest June, I guess, I don't want to say hater. That doesn't necessarily feel right. I didn't want him to fail. I don't want any player to fail, but I certainly was the biggest June detractor, I think, of any of the major analysts when he was coming over from the LCK. As somebody who watched him from his time in the Challengers League with DRX all the way to his time on the Guangdong Freaks last year in the LCK, I just never saw a player that really had all that much mechanical upside. I was shocked that Fnatic went out and not only got June and brought him over and used an import slot on him, but also replaced Trimby with him, who I thought was just a better player. Like, in every aspect of the game, I thought Trimby was a better player. I thought June would come in and be one of the worst supports in the league, and quite frankly, in Winter, he kind of proved me right. He really wasn't all that good. This bot lane underperformed massively. They had no consistent pressure. They were not able to win lane basically in any circumstance, and things just didn't end up going well. And I was looking at that saying, well, yeah, you know, June's not a good laner. It's always been his biggest weakness as a player. He cannot play Enchanters. He has to play Engagers. There's really no other style that he can pull off at a high level. But then you get into spring, expectations are still relatively low for me. Things don't start off incredibly hot, but game after game, week after week, things start to get better. Week number 3, I think the bot lane really starts to show major improvement. They start to win games for Fnatic. They get them this number 1 seed. I really do think without Noah and June playing as well as they did in the final week of the season, they don't get that number 1 seed going into the playoffs. And then ever since we've gotten to the best of 3s, best of 5s, these major series in the playoffs for Fnatic, this bot lane's been good. And June has quite frankly played by far the best League of Legends of his entire career over the past 2 weeks. I was really ready to, absolutely destroy Fnatic for this decision to bring him over if it continued to be a problem throughout the entirety of the year, but I'm glad to see that whatever synergy Noah and June clearly had together, that they wanted to play with each other so bad, Noah clearly kind of vouching for June to play with him as his support. I'm glad to see that's starting to come into effect, because June was excellent here, didn't allow the Darius to play the game at all on the other side here. Darius had a lot of gold coming out of the early game, and so for the Alistar to be by far the most relevant champion in this entire game, it's just a big credit and a big kudos to how well he played. He was far from the only one who played well. Humanoid had a great game. Big shock. B1 Taliyah continues to look really good. This champion is not balanced. It is not in a good state right now in terms of the game. Pick it if you can. Humanoid looked very mediocre, I would say, on 2 games of Azir in the beginning of this series. He was bad in game 1, and he was better in game 2, but certainly not perfect. Not going to blame it entirely on him. His team didn't have any prio or pressure, but, I mean, look at what he can do when he finally has a champion that he can move around the map with and actually make plays with. with, and also a jungler that he can move around the map with and make plays with. The Volley Bear, as much as I don't think Volley's all that strong as a jungler, especially into some of the other champions that kind of do his job, but a little bit better, a little bit more consistent, at least he can do something in the early game, unlike champions like Maokai that do have to wait a little bit longer into things like Xinjia. You're going into a Sejuani Azir, which is kind of giving up a lot of pressure towards the middle of the map, and now all of a sudden you have a lot more opportunities, you have a lot more chances to go out and do things. You're not necessarily performing better or worse, you're just giving yourself the opportunity to show that you can perform better than what you've been doing in the first couple of games, and so already I think this is infinitely better. Even something like the Varus in the bot lane I think fixes a core problem that this team had, was just that you're really not giving your players the opportunity to play their way out of bad situations. You're relying on this scaling, you're relying on the quote-unquote stability that these champions offer, and I just don't think that that is a very cohesive way to win a game. So credit to Fnatic, I think they drafted a lot better, and credit to this bot lane, credit to Humanoid, who played really well. Even Oscar played well on the Cassante. I think generally this just was a positive game for them overall, and it kept them alive. For BDS, it's not the worst thing in the world to lose game number 3. You were up 2-0. You don't lose all that much momentum or pressure from it so long as you don't end up losing game 4. You do not want to go to a game 5 with a team like Fnatic that can get white hot at any moment, having lost the last 2 games in a row. It becomes kind of the opposite effect, and so you really don't want to lose any more than this, but there were some concerns with how they played this game. First of all, if I am going to criticize the draft, the real criticism I would have would be that Sej and Azir as a mid-jungle duo is just really passive. It's something I would have complained about. Now, I think it's a little bit offset by the fact that you have R5 Darius on the top side that you can actively play through, and also the Xayah Rakan, which theoretically should still have pressure. Now, it's not going to have the same kind of pressure that it had earlier on in the series, because instead of facing Zeri Lulu, you're facing Varus Alistar, which is definitely going to be a lot more competitive in terms of the 2v2. You have to step up in terms of your individual mechanics. Ice and Labrav were far from the problem this game, but it does introduce some more wrinkles into the equation. It's not so much that I think BDS drafted infinitely worse. Rather, I think Red Side opens up its own set of challenges, and also Fnatic drafted infinitely better than they did in the previous game, and so it was always going to be more contested, but Adam's going to get done of the game on the Darius. I know he's really good at this champion, and there were moments where it was, you know, pretty solid, where he was getting kills when he was allowed to enter these fights, when he was allowed to play the game, but no, June said no thank you. June turned every single one of these fights in the back half of this game into a 5v4, and Adam was just not a part of this game. When he was finally getting into these fights at the end, he was just instantly dying, getting blown up almost immediately, because the Talia, the Varus, they were online at that point, and the Alistar was still going to be there as a primary disengage tool for the Darius. This is the big problem with Darius and Garen and a lot of champions like this, is they can be peeled off super easily, and they don't really have a lot of ways to make that work if the enemy player is playing really well, and June was playing really well in this game. So unfortunately for Adam, he wasn't all that relevant. Again, I also think Sheo and Nuke could have perhaps been a bit better. Nuke in particular, I think, had a little bit of a rough game on Azir. Didn't exactly have a ton of like amazing moments in my opinion, but these are nitpicks. These are nitpicks more than they are concrete facts in my opinion. BDS is still in an okay spot. Again, as long as you don't drop this game number 4, as long as you can still end this series without Fnatic putting up a fight, you're going to feel pretty good going into the finals. But Fnatic is down. They are certainly not out just yet. Winning game 3 was the start, but winning game 4 is really going to push that momentum into their favor. Can they push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or is BDS going to close off this series and show that game 3 was a bit of a fluke? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Fnatic. They are gonna take game number 4. We are tied up at 2 apiece, and we are heading to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. The reverse sweep is in play, and I didn't want to mention it in the first couple of games. I didn't want to bring it up, but PTSD flashbacks are coming to the brain of this BDS team. 4 of the 5 members that suffered a reverse sweep in the LEC finals in the spring split of last year to miss MSI, they are now 1 series away again from making MSI, and they are potentially about to get reverse swept again. It would be an absolute disaster for this team. I hate to even bring it up at all, but obviously the series has already happened. I can't jinx them now. Plenty of people have already started talking about it. It's just a crazy circumstance, but Fnatic just played excellent in this game. A couple of players on BDS really had a bad one, even though a couple of players on BDS had a really good game. It just didn't end up mattering. Fnatic was better across the board, and that meant that they were the team team that was going to be picking up the win here in Game 4. Player of the game is once again going to go to June. I am so ready. I'm so ready to be on board. Like, I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am that June has figured out how to play League of Legends. I want to reiterate, this doesn't change the fact that he was horrible in the LCK and that, quite frankly, he was not very good in the Winter Split. He was a bottom 2, bottom 3 support in the Winter Split. But man, if this is the June that we're going to get for the rest of the year, sign me up for this. I want Fnatic to be interesting. I want this bot lane to be good. I want players to succeed. And man, June's succeeding right now. It's certainly working out. Those Blitzcrank hooks literally won them the game. It is genuinely insane how consistently he was able to change the tides of fights or start skirmishes or break things open for Fnatic just by playing Blitzcrank, by moving around the map, by being in the right place at the right time. An excellent game from him, both from a mechanical and from a macro perspective. This is elite support gameplay the last 2 games. There's nothing else to say. This bot lane has been such a positive, and trust me, Noah was also excellent in this game on the Kalista. You still have to capitalize on the plays that are made by your playmaker, but you have to count for the fact that June was the one who created a majority of those big plays for Fnatic in this game. He is truly playing exceptional in this series, and I cannot be happier to say that. Him and Noah, I think, have really become, I don't want to say one of the scarier bot lanes in the league, but certainly one of the ones that are going to be up there in terms of contention for scariest bot lanes. Humanoid was also very good on Aurelion Sol. We're seeing why this champion is at least still relatively prioritized in matchups like Azir or, other scaling mid laners. Orianna kind of fits this category a bit. Anything that's really not Talia. I think that Aurelion Sol is really, really dangerous to play into because he is going to just inevitably outscale you. I'm not one for just like inevitable outscaling, but if you're going to play Kalista Blitzcrank, super aggro on the bot side, even Jax can make some plays in the early game, can facilitate some action, can skirmish if need be, and especially if the enemy's going to pick Azir, if they're going to pick Ashe, Nautilus as a bot lane, like you can get away with Aurelion Sol in this draft. Now, did they know all that when they picked it? No. I wouldn't necessarily pick it R1. I don't think it's one of those champions that I would feel super comfortable with in almost any circumstance, but it did end up working out here, and honestly, Aurelion has looked great almost every single time it's picked in Pro, so what do I know? Oscar was deathless. That's always a good sign, and Razork was relevant on the Jax, but June, Noah, Humanoid, they were the carries this game, specifically Noah and June. This bot lane has been the centralizing focus for how Fnatic has wanted to play the last few weeks, and that's been nothing but a positive for them overall. But for BDS on the other side, again, you just got to put whatever voodoo is happening right now out of your mind. You have to put the pressure, you have to put the circumstance out of your mind. You can't be thinking about the fact that you got reverse swept last year in a very similar circumstance. This time in the semifinals, of course, last year it was in the finals. Perhaps a bit of a worse feeling in that circumstance, but you just have to separate it. You have to separate the idea because you can still win this series, but you can't play like this. You can't play like you did in Game 4 and expect to win this. Labrav is going to get done of the game. If you would have told me going into this series that June was mega outclassing Labrav, who I consider to be the best support in Europe right now, I would have never in a million years believed you. I would have thought June would have had to play out of his mind and Labrav would have to completely run it. Unfortunately, both of those things have happened for BDS. Labrav was awful in this game on Nautilus. When he was hitting hooks, they were at the wrong time, and when he wasn't, he was getting Blitzcrank hooked into his certain doom. He was just constantly dying over and over, and obviously at the end of the game, when you don't have the items to be able to survive that kind of engage, it's not like there's a better target to get hit. Like, what are you gonna do, not block the Ashe? Like I don't know what you're supposed to do on Nautilus, but man, he was useless the entirety of this game. I think you could say similar things about Nuke in the mid lane on this Azir. For it being a signature pick, it's really not worked out all that well in this series. I think Azir, in general, has looked very weak, 0-4 through the first 4 games, and I think generally that's just because, especially in a league like the LEC that's a lot more early action oriented, if you're not able to skirmish as well as the other champion on the other side of the map or the other team on the other side of the map, you're probably not going to be able to keep up in terms of the snowball that ends up rolling out of control, and Azir just generally doesn't have that same kind of priority and power. Now, we've seen it work in a lot of other regions. I'm not trying to sit here and say Azir is a bad pick by any means, but there is a reason it's 0-4 in this series, and I think that was showcased well in this game number 4. Ice picked Ashe, AD carry, very weak in terms of damage. I understand the idea if you want to enable the Azir to carry the game, but really going to be hard to put him in that position. Xin Zhao does not synergize well with Azir, and Adam on Gragas didn't really get to do anything, and so you're looking at a comp that, while it does have upside, has some major flaws, and the upside didn't exactly play well. Nuke, Labrav, they didn't have good games, even though Sheo was, in my opinion, very good in this game, constantly out-jungling Razork in the early game, constantly applying pressure for BDS. It never mattered. Like, what was he able to transition that into? Almost almost nothing. The pressure, the power of the jungle just wasn't there. Everybody else lost. It's hard to play jungle when every single one of your lanes is losing. So, you know, unfortunately for BDS, they just, again, have to put it out of their mind. If they go into that Game 5 fearing the reverse sweep, then that is what is going to happen. They have to go into Game 5 with the expectation that they can figure things out, get back to basics, and win that game. For Fnatic, you have to go into game number 5 with the exact same mentality that you've been going in with games 3 and 4, and that is nothing to lose, only things to gain. Noah and June have been exceptional. June in particular. Humanoid has found his groove towards the back half of this series. Oscar has stopped making mistakes. These things need to continue, but game number 5 has become the most important game of the LEC split up until this point. The winner goes to MSI. The loser's split is done until summer. So who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Fnatic. They are gonna take game number 5. The reverse sweep is complete, and they are gonna be heading to the LEC finals. They are gonna be heading to the mid-season invitational for the first time in many, many years. I can't even imagine how many years it has been. It's certainly pre-COVID, I would imagine, the last time Fnatic was at MSI, but for them to get back there in such a commanding, astounding, unbelievable way, I mean, this is awesome. A fantastic storyline. We will get to the players that really stepped up and pushed Fnatic over the top, but this was a great game number 5 from them. They really controlled the back half of this series. There were more ups and downs, I would say, in this game than there were in games 3 and 4, but I think that has more to say about games 3 and 4 than it does about game number 5. Still very Fnatic favored for BDS. This has to sting, and not just a little. This has to really sting. I can't imagine this feels remotely good at all for them, because I mean, not only is this heartbreaking in the fact that you were up 2-0 and you were 1 game away from going to MSI, but this is the second year in a row that that's happened. I know they got to play at Worlds. I know they made the main stage, but it's just different getting the opportunity to represent your region at MSI. Less spots, I'm not going to say more prestigious, because Worlds is a more prestigious tournament, but certainly a more selective tournament. It's harder to qualify for. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's more prestigious or anything like that, but it is more difficult, and it does show that you are one of the best teams in your region if you can get to MSI. And unfortunately for BDS, for the second year in a row, they will have to stay 1 game away. They will have to stay on the outside. And unfortunately for BDS, this is a team that has now finished, and we'll talk about this more. They've now finished 3rd in both splits, and they've yet to win a best of 5. It is genuinely crazy how things have worked out. I want to reiterate, they have not won a best of 5 in 2024. They have lost to G2 twice, and then of course they lost to Mad Lions last split, and they lose to Fnatic here. So a lot of question marks about BDS, but we'll talk about Fnatic first and foremost. Player of the game is going to go to Noah on his signature Ezreal. This is the champion that I think most people associate with him. I think the Aphelios is up there in terms of the picks that I think people think of when they think of Noah, but really for me it is Ezreal. It's clearly always been a comfort, a pocket pick, if you will, for his time in the LEC. It was like that on KT Rollsters back in the day as well. This has always been something that he has been very willing to pull out in almost any circumstance, and obviously this is a pretty good time to go to comfort. Now, I don't think Ezreal is in a particularly strong state right now, especially in comparison to other AD carries who I think all accomplished something very big, but if you want to allow June to be this big primary playmaker like he was in games 3 and 4, then yeah, pick Ezreal. Let him, side lane by himself, let him kind of just survive, and he'll be useful in the mid game. He can skirmish alongside the Rel, you can create plays for him, and he can also be very relevant in the team fight stage. If you do want to try to make plays for him with the Rel plus Nautilus combo, you can do that. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to play the game, but I guess when Noah is as good as he is, then yeah, you can get this Ezreal to be essentially a hyper carry for this team. So credit to Noah, he was awesome. He was really good across this whole series. Unfortunately for me, not good enough to be player of the series, but good enough to get a shout. Player of the series is going to go to his bot lane partner, June, in the support position. Again, I'm so glad to be wrong. June was excellent in this series, and I just didn't see it. I don't think he had ever put out tape in his time in Korea that led me to believe that he was ever going to be an average player. But, give him more time, give him the ability to develop alongside Noah, to get more comfortable playing in a new country, a new continent, and, give him the opportunity to mesh with the rest of his teammates, and he can sit here and put out the best performance of his entire career. It's not even really up for debate. I don't even think this is particularly debatable as a topic. These 3 games in this series in in general is the best performance June has ever had as a professional League of Legends player. I don't really see any other way to classify it. He was excellent. He was like a game breaker in this series. He wasn't just good. He was going against arguably the best support in Europe right now in terms of the performances that have been offered in 2024, and he absolutely gapped him. We'll talk about Labrov in a second, who did not have a good second half of this series, but June was a big reason for that. June was by far the best player on both of these teams in this series, and that is the big difference maker, so credit to him. Humanoid definitely stepped things up. We finally got an Azir win. He ends the series at 1-4 instead of 0-5 or anything like that, so nice to see Humanoid actually be able to win on the champ. Still wasn't like the most useful thing in the world, but it was solid. They gave Oscar Rek'Sai, which has been a champion that ever since the rework he has favored pretty heavily, and he definitely is able to win early on. It does give him a lot of the tools that he likes. It gives him mobility, escapability, stability in the top lane, all of these abilities, but it also gives him the ability to play more aggressive, which I think is generally what he's looking for. That's not to take anything away from Adam, who was by far the best player on BDS in Game 5 here, but we'll get to that. And Razork was also good. Again, more of a playmaker, a creator alongside June, but to set up for Azir, to set up for Ezreal can sometimes be a bit more challenging to do in the mid game. Luckily, this team had a very good idea of where they wanted to go, and they did it. They're moving on to the finals. They're moving on to MSI. Congratulations to them. But for BDS on the other side, again, heartbreak. I mean, truly heartbreaking. You can't let this defeat you. You've still got a year left to play. Like, Summer Split's going to be right around the corner. I know it feels like it's forever away and MSI's all in between, but Summer's going to come a lot faster than you would expect, and so you have to be ready to kind of just turn this around. Go back out in Summer and get yourself to Worlds. That has to be the goal now for BDS. I know it's an unfortunate way to look at things, but it just has to be the reality for them. Dud of the game here in Game 5 is going to go to Labrov. Like I said, he was just outclassed, and I think support in the LEC has been a rather weak role over the course of this year, and we kind of saw that coming. I said a lot in the preseason that it's like, okay, it's Mickey X, clears the #1. He's had a bad split, by the way, a bad year, quite frankly. And Labrov probably at #2, and that doesn't feel great. Hylissang could be at #2. That also doesn't feel great. And then, like, who else? Like who else is even in the conversation? And really, nobody has stepped up into that role. Now, June could potentially be progressing into that. I know a lot of people really wanted him to be there. He was very much not in winter. It wasn't even close. Alvaro is obviously somebody that people like a lot, but support is wide open for the taking at the top, especially with someone like Labrov really struggling, because I do think he has been the most consistent support in the LEC this year. He dominated the winter split. He was excellent in the regular season, and I think he's been a positive for this team all year, except in this series when they needed him the most. So, unfortunate, and similar things can be said about Nuke. Now, I'm certainly not saying that Nuke is a bad player or a one-trick or anything like that. There has been a lot of news about Adam and Nuke over the course of this week on social media. If you know, you know, and I certainly don't agree with the things that have been said about them and about this team. Not that that should surprise anybody who watches this channel, but what I am going to say is that there is a bit of a history with Nuke not necessarily performing in big moments. He was pretty bad in the finals last year when they made it in the spring split. He got destroyed by G2 in the previous series, not only this split, but he got mega destroyed in the winter split when they played off against each other in a best of 5. It's just not been a great look. I think it's more of him being in his own head about it rather than any sort of mechanical problem, although Nuke did kind of break out or re-break out as somebody who could be average at this level, the last couple of years. He's above average as a mid laner, but he was not average at all at the beginning of his career, and so there are some potential concerns that perhaps it is a playstyle problem for him. I'm certainly not going to go that far. He has been more of a positive to this team than a negative. It just wasn't a great series for him. I think you can say everybody else in this team was fine. Ice had a very good series, even if he wasn't impactful almost at all in this final game. Sheo, I thought, was really good for a lot of these games on the Xin Zhao, just not really much to do when you have so many losing lanes, and Adam was by far the best player on this team in game number 5 on the Zac. It just wasn't enough to actually be able to win the game on R5 Zac. You need your teammates to actually step up. That champion can't hard carry, and Adam, I think, was just unfortunately the player that you probably should have been investing in to try to hard carry you out of this game 5. But for BDS, again, you just got to retool. You got to figure things out. Your spring split is done, but that does not mean your 2024 is done. Summer's around the corner. Worlds is going to be your target. This team is very realistic to be a team that gets there and gets there relatively easily, I would say, and so hopefully they can figure out whatever their woes are in these best of 5s and get to the place that they should be at all along. But for Fnatic, massive win. I can't understate just how big this is for the org and the players and the general perception of everything. This is huge for them, and they've earned it. They have earned it at every single step of the way. This team is finally, this historic organization is finally making their way back to an MSI. They are making their way back to a finals to take on, their historic rival, and I for one, am just incredibly excited to see where it goes. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC semifinals overview and analysis video here in the spring playoffs, and we know our final two. It is determined, it is decided, and it is a classic matchup. G2 taking on Fnatic, the two most historic teams in European League of Legends, going head-to-head for the first time in a while in a grand final. Of course, not much on the line in terms of, international qualifying or anything like that. These are the two teams that will be representing Europe at MSI this year. However, winning the LEC is an accomplishment in and of itself. That's the pride that these two teams are going to be fighting over. That alongside the fact that, of course, winning the LEC means you get into the main stage of MSI and don't have to go through the play-in. And so definitely at least something to play for here. I think G2 are going to feel themselves pretty heavily in this series. I think anybody going up against G2 is going to be considered an underdog, and Fnatic is certainly not a perfect team by any means. If they come out and they're able to beat G2, I think a lot of people, me included, will consider that an upset, but G2 doesn't have a ton to play over. They really have kind of proven everything up until this point. If they take this series a little less seriously, I would have understood, and I've said that the entirety of the playoffs, but that has not come into play really at all yet. They have been everything they've been advertised to be, and then some. I know this team has flaws. I know Mickey X is playing really bad right now. I know that there are going to be times where Hans and Broken Blade aren't exactly perfect, even if they have been better in the spring split than they were in winter split, but I just don't see them having any sort of reason to fear. You have Caps, who is by far the best player in the region at the current moment. Yike has also been excellent over the course of this year. So many positive things to say, and yes, Fnatic has had a lot of good things as well. Noah and June have been excellent, especially with June kind of emerging right now. Support's not exactly been a strength for G2. That could potentially be a gap in the same way that it was at the end of the BDS series for Fnatic. However, I just don't think they have the firepower to be able to keep up. I could be wrong, but we saw it earlier on in the playoffs. We saw what it looked like when these two teams went head-to-head, and both of them were trying their absolute hardest, and G2 came out on top easily in that series. I would expect something similar, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that assessment down in the comment section below. Do you think that Fnatic has an opportunity to be able to take this, or do you think they should be considered a lot closer than maybe I'm considering them right now, or do you think G2 is going to be going into this as heavy favorites? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LEC on this channel, we post about the LCK and the LPL playoffs as well. Semifinals for the LPL coming up very soon. Finals for the LCK happening as I'm recording this video, so all of that stuff's going to be out very soon. And of course, MSI is just around the corner. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.